Hello, 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 and howdy doody to you, geographers. Let's talk about Australia on the move. So, in this one, we're going to talk about internal migration. So, people moving around Australia, not external migration where they move to other countries, but Australians moving from one part of Australia to another, whether that be from one state to another or from city to country or whatever. And in a pandemic year or years, there's no external migration. It's been illegal for Australians to leave the country since March 2020. So if there is any migration going on at the moment, it's internal migration. So let's talk about that. Got some learning goals here. Write these down. The first one is you're going to know why Australians migrate internally. They're searching for improved well-being is the quick answer to that. And you're going to be able to interpret a map. I'm going to show you a map of migration patterns in Australia, and you're going to interpret it by answering some questions about it. So get those ones down. So we've got a knowledge learning goal and a skill learning goal. Okay, internal migration. How mad is that? The average Aussie is going to live in 11 different houses in their life. I'm well above that average. I went to 10 schools spread around New Zealand, so there you go. So we've moved quite a lot. That's a lot more than, say, the US, for example. 40% of Aussies have moved in the last 5 years. So there's a lot of internal migration. This is a big deal. And 6% of Aussies have moved from another, 6% of people have moved from another country to Australia in the last 5 years. That means 6% of all, take the last 2 years out, that should be the last 7 years because this was written before the pandemic. So 6% of all people in Australia moved here in the last 5 years from another country. And as we have mentioned, most Aussies live in the southeast. Remember, there's that urban, there's that big population density from Brisbane, going down Gold Coast, down through New South Wales, ACT with Canberra, and then Melbourne, and then all the way out to Adelaide. Let's have a look at some graphics, shall we? Here you go. So in 2015, 2016, of all the states, New South Wales had the most people moving out. The most common internal migration in Australia is people moving away from Sydney. Think about why people might want to move away from Sydney. It's a city of about 6 million people, lots of traffic, lots of jobs, but look, the main reason why people move to cities is for jobs. However, because we've got lots of great technology these days, you can actually work remotely. So maybe one of the reasons why people are moving away from Sydney is because they don't need to live there for their job, because they can do their job on the internet and they can live somewhere smaller that might have a better quality of life. Who knows? I'd be quite interested to see the update for this, because I have a feeling that Victoria is now the Australian state with the most outbound movers, as we are the most locked down state in the world. That's just my guess. Okay, here's a graph. First thing to do with the graph is to scan all of it to see what you can learn just by the titles before you get stuck into it. So remember, the first thing you want to ask yourself is, what is it about? It's about Australian internal migration across these 2 years. So this data is only for 2016 and 2017. So it's about Australian internal migration. We know that means Australia is moving from one part of Australia to another. Right. This is actually a graph created by a private company, Allied Pickford, the Careful Movers, right? So this is a moving company. So this is an ABS, stands for the Australian Bureau of Statistics, and orange is Allied Pickford's, that company there. So it's comparing what the Australian Bureau of Statistics has said about internal migration and the moving that Allied Pickfords have done. The question you need to ask yourself is, which of those two pieces of data is going to be more reliable? The information from a private company or the information from the Government Bureau of Statistics? You got it right, it's the ABS. Right. So as you can see there, a lot of internal migration. So if it was at 0, that would mean, so we've answered our first question, what's the graph about? It's about internal migration. Now the next question is, what can we learn from this graph? If it's below the line, that's saying people are moving away from those places. If it's above the line, people are moving to those places. So in general, and this is only for 2016, 2017, remember, this is not going to be true for the pandemic years. People are moving away from Sydney, Adelaide, Perth, and Darwin, and they're moving to Melbourne, Brisbane, and Canberra. Now, do those all add up? Probably not, because people don't just move from one capital city to another. They move from capital cities to smaller cities or rural areas, whatever. So there you go. Melbourne, yeah, up until the start of the pandemic, Melbourne was very, very popular with international migrants and with internal migrants. Melbourne was due to beat Sydney for being the most populated city in the country, but that's probably going to be delayed by quite a bit now. Anyway, here's another map. So that's quite cool. ACT. So, right, it's a diagram. First thing to do, look at the title, see if we can figure out what it's about. ACT, Interstate Migration, ACT, Australian Capital Territory. Basically Canberra with a few paddocks around the outside. Okay, so this is the net flow of interstate migration for the ACT. So it's saying where people are moving from to get to Canberra and where people are moving to away from Canberra, right? So it's represented in two different ways. You've got just the straight up arrows here and then a map. They both tell you the exact same information, but the map can make it a little bit cooler. Makes it a little bit. So what we can say is that people from Canberra are moving to Victoria and to Queensland. But every single other state, people are moving from those states and territories to Canberra. Well, it's interesting to think, are they the actual numbers? They're saying they're very small numbers. 622 Canberrans moved to Victoria in the year to March 2018. Okay, well, that's not really large amount of migration, I wouldn't think. 47 Tasmanians moved to the ACT in 2018. Anyway, small numbers. Okay, some more notes. Sea change and tree change. Lots of people now want to move from urban to rural locations. They want a sea change, i.e. to live by the beach. Why? They want a more peaceful life. The idea being that it's more peaceful down by the coast than in a big city. They want to know their neighbours. Although I would say, couldn't you just get to know your neighbours in a city? Anyway. And they want to relax more. The idea being that if you live by the coast, you're going to relax more because there's a beach right there. You can go and hang out there, yada, yada, yada. However, lots of small towns can't actually handle the number of people that are moving in, and this causes problems, especially with COVID-19. So, yeah, as I mentioned earlier, because more people are being asked to work from home, if you work from home, you don't need to live in a big city. You don't need to live by the office because you can do it all from the internet, right? And because now heaps of work can be done from home. Even teaching, don't need to live near your workplace, so you can live wherever you want. So maybe you're going to move down the coast. That's sea change. It is not actually referenced tree change in here. Tree change is the same as sea change. It's just basically moving to a rural area. The idea being that there's more trees in rural areas. Yeah. So we've got a couple of different things going on here. We've got urbanization. That's the general, more common trend. People moving from rural areas to cities. But there's also a few people moving from cities to rural areas and coasts. That's sea change and tree change. Interestingly, people think that their quality of life is going to improve if they move to rural areas, but as I've repeated ad nauseum, in fact, well-being is higher in cities than it is in rural areas because higher incomes, more access to health, education, cultural stuff like that. Sea change and tree change. Yeah, it's this myth, it's this idea like everyone's so happy in the country. They're not. Sorry. Here are the most common sea and tree change areas in Australia. People moving away from capital cities to Macedon Ranges and Chiltern in Victoria. Those places in New South Wales and Timbru. Right, FIFO workers. That's the acronym, fly in, fly out, FIFO. These are mining industry jobs so you have the mines out in the middle of nowhere and people fly out to those mines, work there, and then fly back to where they live. But the place that they fly out to, there's nothing there. It's just jobs. So it's very weird. My brother does it. He flies out to some place in the middle of nowhere, lives there for 3 weeks away from his family. It's just mostly just like young men, so I can't imagine it'll be that exciting to do that. But anyway, that's what he does. So people fly to and from work, and actually, this is pre-pandemic. You even find people that would live in like Bali and fly to a mine in WA, and then fly back to their home in Bali, because Bali is in Indonesia. Indonesia is a poorer country. The money that you earn from working in a mine in Australia, you're rich as when you live in Bali with all that Australian money. Yes, and so the problem is that all these small towns where the miners work, they use the town, but they take their wages back home with them. So there's not a lot of investment into the actual FIFO towns that people go to. Here's a little infographic showing the effects of FIFO work practices. So, firstly, parenting's a problem. Typically it's the man, but it might be the woman. So you often have the mum having to look after the kids at home. That happens with my sister-in-law. She has to look after their 2, and she's pregnant, so soon to be 3 kids, while my brother is out in the mines for 3 weeks. And there's some more generally negative impacts on children because they've only got one of their parents there. It's quite hard to communicate. You got to do it through the phone or internet or whatever. And there are benefits and challenges to the FIFO lifestyle, and I'll let you have a look at a couple of them. Yeah, loneliness and isolation, I think, is the main one. But people who fly in, fly out workers on mines do earn lots, but they work pretty hard. Anyway, let's talk about seasonal agricultural workers. So lots of jobs in rural areas are seasonal, like picking apples. So you only need to pick apples at one certain point of the year, and so there's heaps of work in that season, and maybe not so much work other times. And these areas need lots of workers just for a few months of the year. You don't usually find the locals from the apple growing areas who do that work. It's usually others. The local young Australians often move away to big cities, and so they don't end up doing it. It's the same. My mother had an apple orchard for about 20 years, and it was the same situation. She found it very hard to get locals to work on her orchard because the work is hard. It's not really that well paid. And so what Aussies do, and what they do in New Zealand as well, is they often rely on backpackers or short-term workers who come from Asia or the Pacific Islands to work picking fruit, picking vegetables, all that kind of stuff. It's hard work. It's very, very important work. It's food, right? If they didn't do that work, you'd be hungry, or the price of your food would get ridiculous. And it's been a real struggle during the pandemic years to get these seasonal agricultural workers, because we have not allowed people to come into the country. So where do we get all these workers to pick that fruit? One of the reasons why your fruit and vegetable prices have been high the last 2 years. Here is some of those agricultural workers there. Yep, working hard. I used to do it myself. I worked on my mother's orchard for a couple of seasons. It's hard work, but it's quite enjoyable because you're outside and it's quite social. There's a big bunch of you outside and you have good yarns. It's time for your map interpretation activity. Here's a map. I'm not going to tell you much about it because you're going to use your skills of interpretation and hear your questions. What elements of border, orientation, legend, title, scale, and source are missing from that map? Which state saw the most migration, or the highest net migration rate? You're going to have to figure that out because the data is not represented just in one unit per state. You'll notice that, say, Northern Territory's only got one data point, whereas WA's got one for the Outback and one for the Perth region. So you need to try and figure out overall which state has seen the most migration and which state's seen the least migration. Here's a good one. This is a maths question for you. If a place got 10,000 migrants in, but 9,000 went out, what colour would it be shaded? So you need to work out the net migration, and then you need to work out the net migration rate as a percentage. And then you need to figure out what colour that would be. So there's 3 steps to that. Figure out the net migration, figure out that net migration as a percentage, figure out what colour that net migration rate percentage is as a colour according to the 4 colours on that graph. And finally, using geographic language, where are people moving to in Australia? Should be fairly straightforward. Okay, a video about sea change and tree change in Australia. Take it away.
If you're suffering a case of the back to work blues, you may be considering tossing it all in and heading for the beach or the country permanently. But don't pack your bags until you've seen this report from Pippa Gardner.
Stressed out? Overworked? A slave to the Monday to Friday grind? Imagine packing it all in for this or this.
I loved Orange. To be honest, I was quite surprised at how different it was to actually live there than to visit.
At 23, Annabelle Moody left the city for the country. After 2.5 years, she missed the buzz of the big smoke. A tree change was not for her.
The career opportunities are quite limiting, and also socially it can be quite limiting. To be honest, I just got a little bit bored with it.
You just didn't spend any time together, and we thought that that's how everyone lived, just running around, trying to make money.
On a whim, Paula and Mick Woodney quit their city jobs and bought a fudge shop in the country.
About one weekend, we closed the door one Sunday night, and both of us laid on the floor, and I was in tears, and I'm just like, I can't do this anymore.
Caroline Cameron advises sea and tree changers on how to make their move a success.
If you have trouble managing money, or your relationship has got some cracks in it, or, you know, if you've got other problems going on in your life, then a sea or tree change isn't going to fix that for you.
Almost 80% of sea and tree changers are under the age of 50 with young families. Demographers say there has been a shift in values between generations. The emphasis is now on working to live, not living to work.
For a lot of people, the stress and costs of city living is just getting too much, and so they're making a tree change or a sea change just so they can save a little bit of money, they can get a breather on the mortgage, and they can have some new lifestyle.
Tanya and Ashley Peeney did just that. They moved their family from Sydney to the Central Coast.
We could rent far better a property up there than we could have afforded to buy.
I loved the beach. I loved waking up every morning and going down to feed the ducks.
But the commute back to Sydney meant Ashley spent most of his sea change in the car.
I ended up sleeping in the office sometimes. The commute added on to the late nights and early mornings meant that I wouldn't see the children.
All of a sudden, I didn't have any backup. I was on my own.
After 12 months, they moved back. It wasn't cheap to retreat.
The removalists, of course, going up and then coming back again, and then the stress on, you know, your best friend who has the truck.
For about 1 in 5, it doesn't work out.
Demographer Mark McCrindle.
They bounce on back to the place from where they came, and that can be a costly exercise and a fair bit of stress involved in that.
While life in the country wasn't sweet to start with, Paula and Mick now love it. With a lot of hard work, they reckon they've perfected the recipe for the perfect work-life balance.
You actually enjoy life. Rather than working so you can afford things to make your life happier, we just have a life that does that.
It'd be great to move back out there again, but at this stage in my life, I think for a young professional, probably the city is the place to be.
It's time for the reflection activity. We're going to do a PMI, that's a plus minus interesting. So using the topic movement within Australia, I ask you, what's one plus about movement within Australia? What's a positive thing? What's one minus about movement within Australia? What's a negative thing? And finally, what's just something that's just interesting about movement within Australia? So fill those things out, do all those notes, take a photo, upload it, you know the drill. Thank you so much for taking part in today's lesson, and as always, keep it real.